You wake up, and within 20 minutes, you deliberately change your own brain chemistry. A cup of coffee, a cup of tea, maybe something stronger, depending on the morning. You don't think of this as a ritual of any kind. It's just Tuesday, just an ordinary part of getting the day started. But the compound sitting in that cup is binding to receptors in your brain that have existed for tens of millions of years, long before humans existed, long before anything resembling a modern human brain existed at all. You've inherited a nervous system riddled with locks that certain plants happen to fit perfectly, almost by accident, and for as long as there have been humans capable of noticing that fit, we have been deliberately going out looking for the plants that fit it best. What follows isn't a story about any single culture's relationship with any single substance. It's a story about a pattern that shows up independently on nearly every inhabited continent on Earth, among people who never once had the chance to compare notes with each other. This isn't a story about one culture, or one plant, or one single era of human history. Archaeologists have found deliberate, ritual use of mind-altering plants on nearly every continent humans have ever lived on, going back thousands of years before any form of written history existed to record it. Different plants, entirely. Different continents, with no contact between them. And yet the same underlying instinct keeps showing up again and again, independently. Find the plant that changes how the mind works. And treat it as something sacred enough to build entire rituals. And sometimes entire temples around. By the time we're done, you'll have seen this exact pattern repeat itself across 3 separate continents, 3 separate plants, and roughly 10,000 years of unconnected human history. High in the Andes Mountains of South America, archaeologists have found direct evidence: preserved leaves, chewed quids, and specialized lime-carrying containers, showing that people were using the coca leaf as far back as 8,000 years ago. Chewed together with a small amount of mineral lime, the leaf releases mild alkaloid compounds that reduce fatigue and appetite, and help the body cope with the genuinely thin oxygen found at high altitude. This wasn't recreational in any casual sense. In the punishing environment of the high Andes, where farming and travel meant constant, grinding exertion in oxygen-poor air, this leaf became something closer to essential equipment than a luxury, so central to daily and religious life that later Andean civilizations, including the Inca, considered coca a direct gift from their gods. Reserved in its purest form for priests, rulers, and formal sacred ceremony. Spanish colonial records from centuries later, written by chroniclers who initially tried to suppress the practice entirely, describe entire administrative systems built around regulating who could grow, distribute, and use the leaf. An entire bureaucracy constructed around a single plant, inherited from an empire that had already been managing it carefully for centuries before any European ever set foot in the region. Archaeologists studying burial sites across the region have found coca leaves placed deliberately alongside the dead, suggesting the plant's significance extended even into how these cultures understood the afterlife itself. Chemical analysis of hair samples taken from mummified remains in the region has allowed researchers to confirm regular coca use stretching back across multiple generations in the same family lines, suggesting this wasn't an occasional indulgence, but a sustained, culturally embedded practice passed down deliberately from parent to child. Centuries later, in the same mountain range, a massive ceremonial complex called Chavín de Huántar became one of the most important religious centers anywhere in the ancient Andes. Carved into its stone walls are clear, repeated depictions of a columnar cactus known today as San Pedro, a plant containing compounds capable of producing profound alterations in perception. Archaeologists have also recovered specialized snuff trays and preparation tools at the site, evidence that the substance was processed and administered as part of formal temple ritual, likely overseen by trained priests, not casually consumed by the general population passing through. Excavations have also uncovered an elaborate network of stone air ducts and water channels built directly into the temple's foundations, engineered specifically to control sound and airflow throughout the underground chambers, meaning the disorienting acoustic effects visitors experienced weren't accidental byproducts of the architecture, but a deliberately engineered feature the temple's builders understood well enough to construct on purpose. The imagery, carved alongside the cactus, fanged deities, transforming figures, part human, part animal beings, rendered in remarkable detail, suggests the altered state itself was treated as a genuine doorway, a way for a priest to temporarily perceive the world the way the gods supposedly did, then return to ordinary consciousness and interpret what they'd seen for everyone else waiting outside. The temple's architecture itself reinforced this idea physically. Narrow, maze-like stone corridors led visitors deeper and deeper underground before reaching the inner chamber, a deliberately disorienting journey that researchers believe was designed to heighten anticipation and psychological readiness well before any ritual substance was even introduced. Halfway around the world in what is now southern Spain, archaeologists excavating a site called Cueva de los Murciélagos found something remarkable preserved inside an ancient burial. Sealed containers holding poppy seed capsules, dated to roughly 6,200 years ago, among the oldest physical evidence we have anywhere, of opium poppy use tied directly to ritual or burial practice. Meanwhile, in ancient Sumer, one of the earliest literate civilizations in the world, cuneiform tablets dating back over 5,000 years contain a symbol scholars translate as the joy plant, widely believed to refer to that same poppy. Two entirely unconnected civilizations, separated by thousands of miles of ocean and mountain, both independently leaving behind physical or written proof that they had identified the same plant, understood its effects with enough clarity to record them, and considered it significant enough to preserve, write down, and bury alongside their dead. Later Sumerian medical texts go even further, listing specific preparations involving the plant among treatments for pain and sleeplessness, suggesting the substance had moved beyond purely ceremonial use and into something closer to an early, documented pharmacy by the time writing itself had matured as a technology. Both civilizations, working independently, appear to have arrived at a similar conclusion within a few centuries of first identifying the plant. That something this powerful needed formal, written acknowledgement, not just word-of-mouth tradition passed loosely between generations. Here's the piece of neuroscience that ties all of this together. The human brain and body are threaded with entire receptor systems, including ones that respond to opioid-like compounds and ones that respond to cannabis-like compounds, that evolved tens of millions of years before humans existed. Originally to work with chemical messengers, your own body produces naturally for regulating pain, mood, and stress. These plants didn't have to design a way into your brain from scratch. The lock was already sitting there, evolved for an entirely different original purpose, and certain plant compounds simply happened to fit that lock closely enough to trigger it anyway. Some researchers describe this as a kind of evolutionary accident, a genuine coincidence of biochemistry between two completely unrelated branches of life, plants and animals. That turned out to share compatible molecular shapes despite splitting apart on the evolutionary tree hundreds of millions of years earlier. Ancient people didn't need to understand any of this underlying chemistry to notice the effect firsthand. They just needed to notice that certain plants did something no other plant in their environment did, and that noticing alone was enough to build entire temples around. It's worth sitting with how strange this coincidence actually is. Biologically speaking, plants have no nervous system, no brain, nothing resembling the receptors they're interacting with. They evolved these particular chemical compounds for entirely unrelated reasons, as defenses against being eaten by insects, in many documented cases. And it's only by sheer molecular coincidence that some of those defensive compounds happen to fit neatly into locks sitting inside a completely different kingdom of life. Two branches of the tree of life, separated by roughly 1 billion years of independent evolution, somehow ended up speaking a compatible chemical language neither one ever intended to develop for the other's benefit. Picture the ceremony at Chavín, deep inside the stone temple, where sound travels strangely through carved stone channels, specifically designed to make voices and running water seem to come from everywhere at once, echoing from directions that shouldn't be possible. The priest has fasted, prepared, and consumed the San Pedro extract according to a process passed down and carefully refined over many generations before him. Torchlight throws long, shifting shadows against carved reliefs of fanged, transforming deities lining the chamber walls. The priest's vision begins to shift, colors and shapes bending subtly at the edges, the boundary between self and surroundings growing gradually thinner. To the ordinary people gathered at a respectful distance outside the inner chamber, none of this is visible at all. What they experience instead is only the sound, low, layered, genuinely otherworldly, echoing out of solid rock as if the mountain itself were speaking directly to them. When the priest finally emerges, hours later, visibly shaken, eyes wide, they are treated not as someone who simply got high, but as someone who has just returned from somewhere the rest of the community fundamentally cannot go on their own, carrying instructions, warnings, or blessings back with them from that place. Elders in the waiting crowd take careful note of everything the priest says in the immediate aftermath, understanding that whatever emerges in those first disoriented minutes carries weight. The community will spend the following days, sometimes weeks, discussing and interpreting together. That specific distinction between a casual, altered state and a genuinely sacred, carefully bounded ritual, one is precisely the distinction most modern framing of this entire subject has completely lost along the way. Attendants stationed near the chamber entrance are trained specifically to watch for signs the priest needs assistance, ready to intervene if the ceremony takes an unexpected turn. A built-in safeguard baked directly into the ritual structure rather than left to chance. Further evidence that this was never treated as a casual or unsupervised act, even by the people who understood it best. Here's the turn. For nearly all of the history we've just walked through, these plants were rare, difficult to prepare correctly, tightly controlled by trained ritual specialists, and used within firm, well-understood social boundaries, specific people, specific ceremonies, specific purposes, nothing casual or unsupervised about any of it. The active compounds existed diluted inside a whole, complex plant, alongside dozens of other compounds that naturally moderated the overall effect. Centuries of later chemistry changed that entire equation, gradually and then quite suddenly. Scientists learned to isolate the single active compound out of the plant, then to concentrate it further, then in some cases, to modify it into forms many times more potent than anything the original ritual plant could ever have produced on its own. Isolating morphine out of raw opium in the early 1800s is one well-documented, specific example of this broader shift. A compound that once required an entire temple's worth of ceremony and social control, wrapped around its use, became, in refined form, something that could be manufactured, transported, and used entirely outside of any of the old boundaries that used to keep it genuinely contained. Within decades of that initial isolation, industrial-scale production methods had turned a substance once measured out, drop by trained specialists, into something manufactured by the ton, distributed through ordinary commercial channels that had no equivalent of a temple, a priesthood, or a waiting community to provide any of the context that had once surrounded it. The ancient instinct itself never went anywhere at all. What actually changed was the container it came in, and the guardrails that used to come built directly into that container. It's worth pausing on just how much deliberate infrastructure surrounded these substances in their original context. Years of training for the specialists entrusted with preparing and administering them, physical architecture designed specifically to contain the experience, social rules dictating precisely who could participate and under what circumstances, and community structures in place to reintegrate anyone who had gone through the ritual back into ordinary daily life afterward. None of that infrastructure survived the transition to isolated, mass-producible compounds. The chemistry got extracted with remarkable precision. The centuries of accumulated social wisdom about how to contain it safely did not make the same journey, left behind somewhere in the transition from temple to laboratory, from priesthood to patent, as if only half of the original invention had actually been carried forward into the modern world. You reach for a substance alone, in private, often without any ceremony of any kind attached to it, sometimes without even fully deciding to, in any conscious sense. They reached for one, after fasting, preparing and receiving it directly from the hands of a trained specialist inside a temple built specifically to contain the entire experience. You might not know the name of the receptor in your own brain that's actively responding right now, this very moment. They didn't know the underlying chemistry either, but they built an entire architecture of ritual, boundary, and shared social meaning around the not knowing, precisely because they understood, more clearly than most of the modern world seems to, how powerful and how genuinely dangerous an unbounded version of that experience could quickly become. Without it, the plants themselves haven't changed much at all. The compounds are, in many documented cases, the very same molecules, chemically speaking. What's mostly disappeared over time is the container, the ceremony, the specialist, the fasting, the firm social boundary around who, when, and why. Ancient humans didn't treat this lightly, because they were somehow more disciplined than we are today. They treated it that way because they understood, with real clarity, exactly how much respect it genuinely required. That understanding took generations to accumulate, refined through direct, sometimes costly experience, then deliberately passed down through trained specialists, rather than left for each new person to rediscover alone, from nothing, on their own terms. Somewhere between the temple at Chavín and the kitchen counter you woke up next to this morning, the ceremony got lost, but the underlying wanting never once did. This has been Foxholes. Stories from the Foxholes. Whatever you reach for to change how your mind feels today, it might be worth remembering just how much ceremony it used to take to earn that same feeling. And how little separates the two of you beyond the container it now arrives in, and how much of that old container simply never made the trip forward with it.